y'all, and welcome back to my channel, or if it's your first time here, welcome especially. My name's Sally and I'm so glad that you've stopped by. If we haven't met yet, I am a metabolic health nutritionist, but I'm also someone who is passionate about delicious food, delicious practical recipes to be specific, things that are not too crazy hard to implement. And so I make a lot of videos that are recipe focused, and that is what I'm going to be sharing tonight. I'm going to be sharing 3 of my favorite, delicious, nourishing, we're going to call them animal-based fall dinner recipes, lunch, dinner, just like savory recipes. Eat them whenever in the day you want to eat them. But specifically, these don't have any grains in them. They are, I hate labels. I hate labels when it comes to diet. And if you watch the video I did on animal-based breakfast a couple weeks ago, I talked about this, but I'm gonna preface here again. I do not like to apply labels to the way that I eat. I just want to eat in a way that is supportive to my body on the metabolic level. However, descriptors are helpful in conveying a message and reaching the right audience. And I guess by definitions, I actually do eat in large part, quote unquote, animal-based. Okay, that aside, I think that it is helpful to people to share some recipes, especially like fall recipes that are a little bit less like grain reliant, because a lot of people don't do the best with those. Ultimately, I don't think that we do the best eating a ton of grains, particularly if those grains are not properly prepared. If they're properly prepared, it's a different story. This is getting long-winded, but the bottom line is don't get caught up in the labels. These are delicious recipes. They're all grain-free, so hopefully that'll be helpful to at least some of you. I wanted to make this because a lot of you really liked the breakfast video that I made. So enough of me babbling, let's get into the first recipe, which is going to be a stuffed spaghetti squash. This is actually, I'm looking at my phone here so I can get the recipe name correct. This is like an adaptation of Half-Baked Harvest roasted garlic spaghetti squash lasagna boats. I found this recipe a few years ago and I've been obsessed with it ever since, but I have made some adaptations just to make it a little bit easier. And my husband, who can't handle conventional dairy, I made some swaps using like lactose-free cottage cheese to get the protein up even more, and so that the dairy doesn't bother him. Here's the recipe.
For this recipe, I use 2 large spaghetti squash, which you need to cook a little bit ahead of time so you can actually cut them open. So I am just pricking them with a knife. I realize this looks a little bit sketchy. It's maybe a little sketchier with this big knife than I realized, but it was okay. Just be careful. And I find it easiest just to heat these in the microwave. So I will put them in there for between 3 and 6 minutes. Like I said, these were on the larger side, so I had to cook them for like 6 minutes a piece. And then while those are doing their thing and then cooling down, I am preparing the other ingredients or other components. So I'm starting out here with, this is part of a large onion, most of a large onion. You could use a full one or just a slightly smaller onion, which I am dicing relatively finely, chopping relatively finely. And this is going to go into a skillet with some oil. You could use avocado oil. I used a little bit of olive oil here since the temperature wasn't going to be too high. Once that oil is nice and hot and you hear a sizzle, you're going to put your onion into the pan with it and just stir it until you don't have to stir it continuously, but give it a stir, return to it occasionally until that onion starts to soften and gently brown. Just get a little bit caramelized. I seasoned with salt and with pepper, just a taste. I never use a specific amount of these ingredients. And then meanwhile, I am preparing some sausages. You just need a pound of sweet or spicy Italian sausage. And so I sliced the casings off those. I took some fresh basil from the garden. I shredded this with my fingers, put it in with the onions, and then I took those sausages and threw them in as well. Used my spatula to break them apart. You could obviously use ground sausage, but this is what was a good deal at the grocery store. And then I just took a pound of ground beef as well. This is 97.3 ground beef. I like the combination of 1 pound ground beef, 1 pound sausage, because you get higher protein, but you still get that good flavor from the sausage. So now I have I think it's like a 14-ounce can of diced tomatoes. These are the, oh my goodness, what are they called? Like the chili roasted tomatoes. Toss them in the pan with the beef and the sausage, and once that's all heated and bubbling, I add about a cup of red wine to add some nice depth of flavor. Don't worry, all the alcohol cooks out of it, but it just really takes this dish to the next level. So that's still sizzling on the stove. I am now continuing to prepare my spaghetti squash. It's still a little bit difficult to cut them in half, so just use a sturdy knife and do so carefully, but you're going to break them in half, and then you're going to use a spoon to scrape out all the seeds and, just the squashy part that's not very tasty in the middle. So pardon the change in light. This is actually the next day. I prepped part of the recipe one day and then the next morning prepped the rest of it. But here I am shredding some cheese. I had just a little bit of Gruyere left over that I used up, and then I had Parmesan. Altogether, I wanted about a cup of shredded cheese, and Parmesan doesn't bother Samuel's belly. Gruyere doesn't either, so we're able to use those. This is lactose-free cottage cheese from Good Culture. Used about a cup of this. I don't worry about measuring too closely because this recipe is very resilient. It turns out very lovely regardless. But about a cup of that cottage cheese, about a cup of the Parmesan, or you could use Gruyere, you could use Fontina, really just whatever you have on hand. Get resourceful with it. And I combined these two ingredients. You can add some salt, pepper. I think the half-baked harvest recipe calls for some nutmeg, which is not my personal favorite in this recipe, but you could do that. I had a little bit of cheese left over, which I just sprinkled in the bottom of the squash to help get the sauce to kind of stick. I also put some salt on the squash as well before adding the rest of the fillings. But now we just go ahead and assemble our lasagna boat. So I'm putting in the sauce/meat, dividing it between the 4 squash. Sometimes I have a little bit left over that doesn't quite fit, and that's okay because it is very yummy to just eat on its own. And once you've divided the meat mixture, you're going to divide your cottage cheese Parmesan mixture between the 4 squashes as well. And then just use the back of a spoon to carefully spread it out across the squash. You want to at least cover the meat mixture, but you can pull it out towards the sides as well. The more surface area you're able to cover, the more of that delicious caramelized, almost like crispy cheese you are going to get at the end. Do your best to loosely tent the squash with aluminum foil, and then put it in the oven. Ideally, you don't want the foil touching the squash, at least minimally, because you don't want the cheese to stick, and you don't really want aluminum in your food, so I do try to avoid that in general. But after 15 minutes at 425, you're going to pull off the foil, and then you're going to put the squash back in the oven, or just close the oven door in my case, and leave them in there for another 15 to 20 minutes until that cheese is nice and golden. At this point, the squash are generally soft. You can always test with a fork to make sure. Here's the end result. They are so beautiful. They are so delicious, potassium rich, protein rich, all the minerals. And you just kind of scrape the squash from the sides and mix it into the center. Truly one of my favorite autumn recipes. Next up, we are making what I call sweet potato smash stacks. I mentioned these in an Instagram story last week and said this recipe deserves an award. It really and truly does. It's so simple, but it feels really fancy and is super delicious. So grab a generous handful of sweet potatoes, wash them, cut them into chunks that will fit in your food processor, and you're gonna shred them. You could do this by hand as well. I generally cut myself with my box grater, so I'm just gonna use my food processor instead. It's also a little bit quicker. And then you're going to heat a cast iron skillet so they get extra crispy over medium to medium high heat. I'm using some leftover bacon grease here, and you're gonna put about 2 tablespoons in the bottom of the pan. You want plenty in this case so you can get a shallow fry and a nice crispy exterior on your potatoes. Take big handfuls of those sweet potatoes, those shredded sweet potatoes, and put them in the skillet, and then just kind of gently smash them down. We're making hash browns here, essentially, sweet potato hash browns. So clump them, smush them down. I can usually fit about 3 handfuls in the pan. It's okay if they touch a little bit. You don't need to keep them completely together, but just having the stacks kind of helps them get crispy. top them with a bit of salt, and then those are gonna do their thing for about 4 or 5 minutes on one side. I have some ground beef here that I am dividing. This is a pound of ground beef. I'm dividing it into sixths, and then I'm going to make smash burgers out of this beef. I like them to be relatively thin. Usually I make like quarter-pound burgers, but in this case, I did sixth of a pound burger so I could get them nice and thin, and I topped them with some seasoned salt. This is, I don't even know, it's just one from this spice shop called Penzies that my family has in North Carolina, and it's really nice. And then you're going to kind of revisit those sweet potatoes as needed after 4 to 5 minutes per side and flip them over. Once again, sorry, this clip is a little bit dark, but you can see they got a little crispy. Those got a little bit more cooked than would have been ideal, but they were still delicious and they didn't ultimately taste burnt. Once they have cooked on both sides, again 4 to 5 minutes, you are going to pull them out and just set them on a baking sheet lined with parchment paper. You want any excess oil to drain off, and you can keep these in the oven at about 225 while you're making the others to keep them crispy. Our burgers are meanwhile going on to another cast iron skillet. You can just season the other side. You'll flip them over. I don't even have a time for you for this. Just flip them over when they seem ready. And once they're cooked fully, you're gonna pop them on a plate. And then I also just stuck this into the oven to stay warm as I finish preparing the other components of the meal. So once I had all my burgers out of the skillet, I put a little more bacon grease in my pan, and then I took some kale and tossed it in with that bacon grease. Just a few handfuls. We're using this kind of as a topping and to get some extra flavor into these sweet potato smash stacks. Added some salt, sauteed that down, and now we're going to assemble. So put one of your hash browns on your plate, top it with a smash burger, add a few more hash browns on top, and then I have a fried egg here, which I just fried off camera with a nice runny yolk. We've got our kale, and then the egg yolk just runs down the sweet potatoes and the burger, and the kale adds a nice salty little crunch. It is delicious. I will be making this on repeat. So let me know if you try it down in the comments. I would love to know if you like it. All right, last recipe is actually one from Basics, my pro-metabolic starter guide. So if you want the full recipe, head over there. The link will be in the description, and I have a discount code for you down there for my viewers on YouTube. But ultimately, we are salting some stew beef, ideally ahead of time if possible, putting some oil into a skillet. I use avocado oil, and once it's nice and hot, just going to brown our beef. I have to do this in batches. I really struggle with browning stew beef. For some reason, I have no problem when I use like a big roast, but when I'm trying to brown stew beef, it seems like no matter how hot I get the pan, it always like gets more liquidy than would be ideal, and it doesn't get the best crust. It still tastes delicious in the end, but if you guys actually have tips for this, let me know down in the description, or in the comment section rather, because I got the first batch pretty brown, but then with the next batches, it was a little bit more of a struggle. So pulling this beef out, and while I continue to work through the rest of it, I'm just going to prep my other ingredients, do a little mise en place, if you will. So I have 2 acorn squash here. These are both from my garden. This one I rescued from a dying squash plant, so it looks a little funny, but it was still good. Once I cut them in half, I just scraped out the seeds. You may need to pre-bake them or pop them in the microwave for a few minutes as well to just make them a little easier to cut. I did kind of stripey peel these so I wouldn't have big bits of skin. It's okay, like the skin's totally fine to eat, but I don't love the texture of it, so I did take some of it off. And then I am just chopping it into little cubes and putting that in a bowl so I have it easily accessible for later. You also have some onion that goes into this, some garlic, different spices. I think the original recipe calls for thyme. There's balsamic vinegar. I always make it just a little bit different because I'm very much like an intuitive cook. I just use what I have on hand. But that original recipe is absolutely delicious, so definitely go check it out. Basics is one of the biggest ways you can support the channel, and I promise that it is chock full of good stuff, not just recipes over 20 recipes, in fact, but it has really just a step-by-step guide of how to support your body at the metabolic level, looking at blood sugar regulation, looking at inflammation management, taking just a holistic view of stress, and then there's even a meal plan in there. But as you can see, everything went in the pot. I added some homemade bone broth that I had just pulled out of the crock pot that morning. We are covering it up to simmer, and voila, here is the end result. This is such a nourishing and ultimately simple meal. So delicious and mineral rich. I hope you guys will try it. But that's it for today's video. Thank you for watching. Until next time, bye y'all.